All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going deep on, well, Principles. That's the title, right? By Ray Dalio. Now, this guy, he's the mastermind behind Bridgewater Associates, a pretty massive hedge fund, and his book lays out this extensive framework, like a whole bunch of guiding ideas he calls principles.
Yeah, and we're talking like a lot of them, something like 200.
Exactly. So our goal today isn't to go through every single one, obviously. Think of this more like a cheat sheet or a crash course to get you up to speed on the core concepts. Like, why are these principles even a thing? What are some of the foundational ones that Dalio himself really emphasizes, and how do they kind of set the stage for his broader approach, especially when it comes to like management and decision making?
Yeah, and I think what's really compelling about Dalio's work is that these principles aren't just some random, like, theoretical ideas he came up with. They're very much rooted in his own experiences, his own journey. And he's surprisingly candid about some of the early setbacks he faced in his career, especially in finance. There's this story he tells about a pretty significant financial loss early on.
Yeah, that's right. He lost so much money, right?
Yes, exactly. And you'd think, that kind of experience might make someone shy away from the whole finance world. But for Dalio, it seems like it almost had the opposite effect. It became this turning point, this driving force to really understand the underlying mechanisms of how things work, especially in the markets. It wasn't just about figuring out how to make more money. It was about deciphering these fundamental forces that drive success and failure.
Right, and that kind of consistency, that like deep-seated need to understand the why behind things, it really permeates all of his writing. Like, he starts by outlining these core life principles, almost like a foundation, and then he goes on to lay out his management principles, which, from what I understand, essentially build upon that same base of ideas.
Yeah.
So if you could wrap your head around those initial fundamental life principles, his approach to management, how he runs Bridgewater, it becomes much clearer.
Totally. It's almost like the management principles are like the practical application of those underlying life principles. And I think our aim today should be to kind of dig into some of those really key foundational concepts. Like, what exactly does Dalio mean by principles? Why does he consider them so critical for navigating, your life, both personally and professionally? And hopefully we can extract some really insightful and maybe even some like actionable ideas for our listeners to kind of chew on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, before we get too far into the weeds, it's worth mentioning that Dalio's path to where he is today was, well, kind of unusual. It wasn't like this straight line from college to finance success. He started out working as a caddy, then got into trading, and then, get this, he found himself right in the thick of it on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange during the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. I mean, that must have been an insane, just incredibly intense and formative environment to be in.
Oh, absolutely. Talk about trial by fire.
Right. And then on top of that, he gets fired from a firm and then decides to take this huge leap and start his own hedge fund, Bridgewater, which obviously becomes this massive success story. But the point is, these weren't just random occurrences. They were like real-world testing grounds where his ideas about how to operate effectively, his principles, were constantly being put to the test and refined and shaped by those experiences.
It's like his life became this living experiment for his principles.
Exactly. So, all right, let's get into some of the core ideas. One of the first things that Dalio really stresses, almost like a central tenet of his whole approach, is this idea of questioning everything. Like, he actively encourages you to challenge every single principle he lays out. He wants you to ask yourself, is this actually true? And I think, for me at least, that was kind of refreshing. It's not about blindly accepting his ideas as like some kind of dogma. It's more about fostering this critical and independent mindset.
Yeah, I totally agree. And he's very explicit about this. He says he sees his writing as a starting point, not the final word. Like, he doesn't expect anyone to just swallow his principles whole, no questions asked. He actually wants you to engage with them, to scrutinize them, to determine if they resonate with your own experiences and your understanding of the world.
Right. And it's not even just about like agreeing or disagreeing. It's more about this process of personal validation, right? Like taking the time to really examine these ideas and arrive at your own conclusions about their truth.
Exactly. It's about owning your beliefs, not just adopting someone else's. And this ties directly into what he considers his most fundamental principle, the bedrock of his entire philosophy, the pursuit of truth. Or, maybe more precisely, the relentless pursuit of an accurate understanding of reality.
And this isn't just some like abstract philosophical ideal for Dalio. It's the very foundation upon which successful outcomes are built.
Right. And it's interesting how his deep respect for nature really shines through here. He sees nature as this incredibly intricate, perfectly calibrated, system efficient, brilliant, almost awe-inspiring. And he suggests that by observing how nature operates, how it rewards certain actions and punishes others, we can glean insights into what might be universally good and bad, like beyond our individual subjective human preferences.
So for him, it's not just about like human notions of kindness or morality. It's more about aligning your actions with these fundamental laws of nature. What he calls good is operating in harmony with those laws, and bad is acting in conflict with them. It's a
Yeah.
very pragmatic, reality-based way of approaching ethics.
Absolutely. And to illustrate this, he uses this example that I'll admit is a bit jarring at first, but it really drives the point home. It's the example of hyenas and wildebeest. That classic image of hyenas taking down a young wildebeest. It's like viscerally disturbing to us, right? It seems cruel, bad in our typical human moral framework.
Yeah, it's tough to watch, for sure.
Right. But Dalio challenges us to look beyond that initial emotional reaction and consider the broader impact, the second and third order consequences. Because in the context of the ecosystem, this seemingly bad event, this act of predation, is actually a vital part of a larger system that promotes overall health and resilience. It culls the weaker members of the herd, strengthens the gene pool, and prevents overgrazing, which would ultimately harm the entire ecosystem. If that dynamic were removed, the long-term consequences would likely be far more detrimental.
It's about adopting a systems perspective, right? Like looking beyond those isolated events to understand the interconnectedness of things, even when individual actions might appear negative on the surface.
Totally. It's about understanding those ripple effects. And speaking of those deeper motivations and drives, another core idea that Dalio explores is this inherent human desire to evolve. It's this constant striving for improvement, for growth, for progress, and he posits that this is actually a more powerful motivator than our desire for material possessions.
So it's not just about accumulating stuff.
Right. It's deeper than that. He frames those things. We often chase the fancy cars, the bigger houses, the prestigious titles, almost like bait, like these external rewards that entice us to strive, to put in the effort. But in that process of striving, of overcoming challenges, of acquiring new skills and knowledge, we evolve. We become more capable, more resilient, and that ultimately is what brings true satisfaction, both for ourselves and for those around us.
Interesting. So the things themselves aren't the end goal. They're more like the fuel for the journey.
Exactly. And I love how he connects this individual pursuit of self-improvement to the overall progress of society. Because when we push ourselves to achieve our goals, when we strive to get better, we often have to overcome challenges, develop new skills, invent new solutions, and that in turn often benefits society as a whole. And society in turn tends to reward those who create value. It's this beautiful symbiotic relationship.
That makes sense. Like if you're constantly pushing yourself to improve, you're more likely to contribute something meaningful to the world.
Exactly. And he even makes this interesting observation about wealth. He says he's noticed a strong correlation between providing something that society needs or wants, creating value, and achieving financial success. It's not simply about wanting to be wealthy, it's about figuring out what you can contribute that the world actually values. And he reflects on his own experience, saying that making a lot of money was never his primary driver. He was always more focused on the work itself, on the impact he was making, and he's observed a similar pattern in other highly successful individuals.
It's like the money is often a byproduct of creating real value.
Right. It's not the goal in itself, but a consequence of pursuing something meaningful.
Okay, so this kind of brings us to another really important distinction that Dalio makes, and this is huge for understanding his approach to decision making. It's the idea of first order consequences versus second and third order consequences.
Yeah, this is crucial. And I think it's something a lot of us struggle with, right? Getting caught up in those immediate rewards and not fully grasping the longer term implications of our choices.
Totally. So to break it down, first order consequences are those immediate results of your actions, the ones that evoke that instant emotional response. They're often the most tempting or the most daunting, depending on the situation. But the second and subsequent order consequences, those are the longer term ripple effects. And those are the ones that ultimately determine whether you actually achieve your broader goals, your long-term vision.
It's like those first order consequences are the surface waves, but the second and third order consequences, those are the deeper currents that really shape the course of things.
I like that analogy. And to make it really practical, think about the decision to exercise. The first order consequences might be like feeling that initial discomfort or that muscle soreness or maybe the inconvenience of carving out the time in your day. But the second-order consequences improve physical health, increased energy levels, maybe a better mood. Those are the things that actually align with that larger goal of overall well-being. And Dalio even uses this really relatable example of like indulging in that delicious but super unhealthy food, that immediate pleasure you get. That's the first order consequence. But the potential long-term health issues, the weight gain, the increased risk of disease, those are the second-order consequences. And they often directly conflict with your larger goals of staying healthy and living a long life.
Yeah, it's that classic battle between instant gratification and long-term fulfillment.
Exactly. And what Dalio suggests is that people who are truly successful in achieving their goals, they're the ones who consistently look beyond those immediate, often tempting first-order consequences and give real weight to that bigger picture, to those longer-term implications.
It's about playing the long game.
Right. And closely tied to this idea of taking responsibility for those long-term consequences is Dalio's strong emphasis on personal accountability. He's like super firm on this point. No blaming external factors, no excuses.
Yeah, he sees blaming external factors as this fundamental detachment from reality. It's basically wishing that things were different, which he points out is utterly unproductive. And more importantly, shifting blame outward, it prevents you from engaging in honest self-reflection and taking the steps you need to take to grow and improve. If you're always pointing fingers, you're not looking inward at what you could have done differently to achieve a better outcome.
It's like blaming others keeps you stuck.
Exactly. It robs you of agency. And this focus on personal accountability really sets the stage for one of Dalio's core actionable frameworks, which is what he calls the 5-step process for getting what you want. And this is where a lot of these foundational ideas we've been discussing, they come into play in a very practical way.
Yeah, this is where the rubber meets the road, right?
Right. And it's designed to be a cyclical process, not a linear one. And the first step, perhaps unsurprisingly, is setting clear, meaningful goals. But he makes a really important distinction here between goals and mere desires.
Yeah, he talks about that a lot, right? Like, what's the difference between a goal and just something you kind of wish for?
Totally. So goals are those things you genuinely want to achieve, things that align with your core values, your long-term vision for yourself. Desires, on the other hand, those are often those alluring first-order consequences that can actually derail your progress toward your goals.
So like wanting to be physically fit, that's a goal. But that craving for a big, juicy cheeseburger when you're trying to eat healthy, that's a desire that could sabotage that goal.
Exactly. It's about distinguishing between what you truly value and what might just provide temporary pleasure. And once you've established those clear goals, the second step is identifying the problems that stand in your way. And crucially, not tolerating those problems, not just accepting them as, like, unavoidable obstacles.
It's about actively recognizing and acknowledging those roadblocks, right?
Yeah, being honest with yourself about what's preventing you from achieving what you want. And then step 3 is about diagnosing those problems, really digging down to uncover the root causes. And this isn't about just identifying the superficial issue. It's about understanding the underlying reasons why that problem exists in the first place. And Dalio makes this really useful distinction between what he calls proximate causes and root causes.
And those are different, right?
Yeah, they're distinct. So proximate causes are typically the direct actions or inactions that led to the problem. For example, I was late to the meeting because I didn't set an alarm. It's describing what happened, and those are often described with verbs, action words.
Makes sense.
But root causes, those are the deeper, often underlying factors that drive those proximate causes. They're often related to like personal characteristics or habits or beliefs. So using the same example, the root cause might be, I didn't set an alarm because I tend to procrastinate and underestimate how long things will take. And those are more often described with adjectives, describing those deeper patterns.
That's really interesting. So it's not just about like fixing that one instance of being late. It's about addressing that underlying tendency to procrastinate.
Exactly. And Dalio argues that addressing those root causes, those deeper patterns, leads to much more sustainable and impactful improvements over time. And once you've identified those root causes, step 4 is designing the plan, figuring out what you need to do to overcome those obstacles and achieve your goals. And he talks about visualizing the path forward, almost like mentally rehearsing how things will unfold, connecting your present actions to that desired future state. And then crucially, writing that plan down, not just thinking about it, but documenting it,
Yeah.
including the specific actions that need to be taken, who's responsible, what the timelines are.
So creating a roadmap.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the final step, which, it might seem obvious, but it's where so many people falter, is actually putting that plan into action, doing what's necessary to push through to completion. And this is all about execution. It's about establishing clear benchmarks to track your progress, holding yourself accountable, and being willing to proactively seek help or resources if you encounter unforeseen obstacles. Because there will always be obstacles, right?
Yeah, it's rare that anything goes exactly according to plan.
Right. And I think it's really important to understand that this 5-step process isn't meant to be this rigid linear sequence. It's iterative. Like what you learn in one step can, and often should, inform adjustments in earlier steps. And he notes that goals tend to be the most stable element, the thing that changes least frequently, followed by that overall strategic design, while the specific tasks and tactics, those might need to be tweaked more often based on what you learn along the way.
It's like a feedback loop.
Exactly. You're constantly gathering information and refining your approach.
And Dalio also points out that people often struggle when they approach these steps in a less effective order. Like, for example, getting too attached to specific tasks or actions without maintaining a clear focus on those overarching goals, on the why behind what they're doing. It's easy to get lost in the weeds.
Totally. And underpinning this entire 5-step process is this absolutely crucial element of accuracy and what Dalio calls radical truthfulness. And this is about being as objective and honest as possible in every single stage, including, and perhaps especially, in your assessment of yourself, your strengths, and your weaknesses.
Yeah, that self-awareness seems to be a recurring theme in his work.
Absolutely, because you can't effectively navigate this 5-step process if you're operating under some delusional self-image or if you're unwilling to confront your limitations and your biases. That commitment to truth, to seeing things as they actually are, that's what fuels the entire system.
So as we start to wrap up this deep dive into Dalio's principles, let's quickly recap some of those key takeaways for our listeners. First, he strongly encourages you to personally validate every principle before adopting it as your own. Always ask yourself, is this true for me? Don't just blindly follow someone else's playbook. Second, that relentless pursuit of truth, of an accurate understanding of reality, that's the essential foundation upon which you can build successful outcomes. Third, that inherent human desire to evolve, to improve, to get better, that's a powerful driving force, maybe even more powerful than the desire for material wealth. Fourth, always be mindful of and prioritize those longer-term second and third-order consequences in your decision-making. Don't get seduced by those immediate rewards or scared off by the initial challenges. Fifth, take full responsibility for the results you experience in life. No blame, no excuses. And finally, that 5-step process. That provides a really practical, cyclical framework for setting meaningful goals and working systematically towards their achievement.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that Dalio's ultimate goal isn't to just have you memorize his principles. He wants you to engage with them, to wrestle with them, to experiment with them in your own life, and ultimately to integrate them into your own personal philosophy. He wants you to move from understanding Ray's principles to developing and living by my principles.
So here's a final thought for our listeners to ponder. Reflect on that 5-step process for getting what you want. Which of those 5 steps do you personally find the most challenging in your own life? Is it clearly defining your goals? Is it rigorously identifying the real problems, not just the symptoms? Is it digging down to uncover those fundamental root causes? Is it designing truly effective plans? Or is it consistently executing those plans through to completion, even when things get tough? How might consciously focusing your attention and effort on that specific step, armed with Dalia's perspective, potentially shift your trajectory towards achieving your most important goals?
It's a great question to ask yourself. And while you're mulling that over, also take some time to consider the principles you already hold, those core beliefs and values that shape your decisions and actions right now. How do they align with, or perhaps differ from, the concepts we've explored today? It's always valuable to examine those underlying assumptions that guide our lives.
Absolutely. And for those of you who are interested in diving deeper into how these foundational ideas translate into a team or organizational context, well, we might just have a future deep dive plan to explore Dalio's more detailed management principles.
Stay tuned for that.
Thanks for joining us for this exploration of principles. We'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.
See you then.